Hello everybody and welcome to this EduSat session. Let me begin by introducing myself. I am Dr. Neera Singh from the Faculty of English here at IGNOU, and I am coordinating the course on New Literatures in English, MEG 8. Today's lecture will primarily be focused on Block 8 of this course. So it's Course 8, Block 8. And Block 8 is the novel The Stone Angel by Margaret Laurence. Now, before I begin delving into this novel and its various aspects, let me give you a very brief run through the various blocks of this course so that you can have an overall sort of a picture in your minds as to what we've taken up in this particular course. Now, Block 1. Could we have the slide, please? Block 1 is the introduction, and in this block we've basically fixed the nomenclature of the term New Literatures in English. We've defined it, and we've basically defined it in relation to why we have not called it Commonwealth Literatures or Post-Colonial Literatures and various other names. And in the rest of the units of this block, we have given you the various countries, the background to the various countries whose literature we've taken up in the other blocks. Now, Block 2 is the African component, and so is Block 3. In Block 2, we have taught you the novel A Grain of Wheat by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and in Block 3, we have taken up the play A Dance of the Forests by Wole Soyinka. Block 4 is the South Asian component with special reference to Ice Candy Man by Bapsi Sidhwa. Block 5, we have taken up the poetry of Derek Walcott and Edward Brathwaite. Block 6 is again the Caribbean component, and we have taught you the Nobel Prize winner V.S. Naipaul's A House for Mr. Biswas, which, as you are all aware, a very, very famous novel. Then Block 7, we have focused on Australian literature with special reference to The Solid Mandala by Patrick White. And Block 8, we have dealt with Margaret Laurence's The Stone Angel, and this is what I shall be focusing on today. Now, this block has 4 units. Unit number 1 is the novelist and her main thematic concerns. We basically give you the biographical details of Margaret Laurence. We've spoken about her African phase when she went and lived in Africa for about 7 years, which had a major influence on not only the previous novels of hers, but also on the later novels which she wrote when she went back to Canada. Then we focused on the Canadian phase. We've spoken about the various awards that she's got and the various themes in The Stone Angel. Very, very briefly, we've touched upon all these. Now, in Unit 2, which is entitled Theme of Self-Alienation vis-a-vis Hagar's character. Hagar, as you know, is the protagonist of this novel. We've taken up this novel as a novel of winding up, as a novel of completion. And we've also spoken about the self-alienation that Hagar feels right through her life. And we've taken up the theme of old age in this novel. Now, in Unit 3 of this block, which is entitled Novel of Awakening, we've spoken about the survival of personality which eventually Hagar is able to achieve. We've spoken about her transition from a state of ignorance to a state of awareness. We've spoken about her evolution. Then we've also taken up the religious roots of the feminine identity. We have spoken about Hagar coming to terms with her past, not only with her past but also with female sexuality per se. Then in the last unit of this block, we have taken up some of the major aspects of the novel. For example, the title, Stone Angel, the imagery, the theme of redemption in the novel, and also Manavaka, which is the town in which Margaret Laurence places all her novels. All means 5 of her last novels. So this is an imaginary town which she has created, very much like R.K. Narayan, who had created a town called Malgudi. So in this session, the themes that I am going to discuss today are certain areas which you may be slightly unfamiliar with. For example, I am going to be speaking of the themes of bondage, flight, and freedom. Now, these are the various themes which almost all the protagonists of Margaret Laurence go through. Initially, when all her novels begin, and you will notice that also in this novel under discussion, The Stone Angel, her protagonists and some of the other characters also are in a state of complete, I would say, a fragmentation of their personalities. They are in a state of ignorance. They are not very comfortable with the place they are at the present moment. And then by employing certain, I should say, survival strategies, they achieve towards the end of the novels a great deal of self-awareness. They achieve a lot of epiphanies, and they are able to gain an authentic existence for themselves. So this is what I'm going to speak of today: bondage, flight, and freedom. Now, to achieve this freedom, there are certain survival strategies that are employed by the characters. Now, these survival strategies can be at a mental level, and they can also be at a physical level, in the sense that, a sort of a mental flight, a flight mentally into fantasizing, into going back into the past through your imagination. So these are some of the survival strategies, along with repression, suppression, projection, these various psychological recourses that a personality takes shelter in. So survival strategies is also something that I shall be discussing today. Thirdly, what I shall be talking about is this town Manavaka, where she places all her stories. This is the setting of all her stories. And I would also be speaking upon Margaret Laurence being a novelist with a social agenda, as well as having certain social responsibilities. As we all know that novelists, for that matter any writer, should not write from an ivory tower. He or she should actually descend to the grassroots levels and address people from there. Similarly, Margaret Laurence also did not write from an ivory tower. She did not lead an ivory tower existence. She was very close to the people for whom she wrote. She in fact had her pulse on the wrist of the target audience, and she had various social agendas which she wanted to project through her works. For example, a lot of contemporary issues like the discrimination against women she has taken up in her novels. Also, another very important issue which she discussed is the discrimination against the native populations. As we all know that the Aborigines, the native residents of the land Canada before the British and the French colonized it, were completely marginalized. They were sidetracked. And even though they had a very rich literature, it was absolutely relegated to the background. And a lot of injustices were committed against them. Now, Margaret Laurence, in all her works, has a strong slant towards giving justice to these marginalized people. Even though you'll notice that in this particular novel, The Stone Angel, it is not very, very apparent. There are instances when she has spoken up for the native, she has spoken up for the marginalized natives, but it's not a very, very strong issue in this novel. However, in her later novels, especially in I think her last novel called The Diviners, she has really taken up cudgels on the behalf of the natives. Okay, however, the discrimination against women, she has spoken very strongly against, even in this novel, right? Now, the first thing that we should take up is Manavaka, because that is the background against which she places her novel, not only this novel, but all her other 5 novels. Now, Manavaka is an imaginary town, very much like the imaginary town which R.K. Narayan has built, which is called Malgudi. It's an imaginary town like Alice Munro has built, called Jubilee. It is like Robertson Davies' Deptford trilogy. He's written 3 novels based in a place called Deptford. He's also written another 3 novels based in an imaginary town called Cornish, which are called the Cornish trilogy, and so on. Now, so the first thing about this town is that it is an imaginary place. Second thing is, it is built by Scottish settlers who fought the natives and the hostile elements. Thirdly, it is a place dominated by male attitudes and social hierarchies. Fourthly, it is a mythical territory but which maps universal human experience. You see, the inhabitants are cut off from each other by pride and social differences. Therefore, that is number 5, it becomes a sort of an emblem of human separateness, of human divisiveness. Actually, this town, Manavaka, is an expression of the forces which exist within human beings, the forces which divide human beings, which lead to alienation, which lead to separation. And when you read this novel, you will realize that all the characters struggle to break out of these confines which sort of confine human nature, and they try very hard to leave this town behind and run away from it. But eventually, all her protagonists come to the conclusion that there is no running away from these forces which are within. And Manavaka, please bear this in mind, is an emblem of all these forces. It is a metaphor. It is a symbol for these confining forces within human beings. All right. And lastly, and I must point this out, is Manavaka is an integral part of all of Lawrence's novels. She has placed all her Canadian novels in Manavaka. So it is a very important aspect of her work, and you cannot really read her novel or cannot do justice by discussing her novel unless you actually know that Manavaka is almost like a living entity in her novels, right? Now, after Manavaka, let's go to the novel itself, The Stone Angel. Let me give you a brief overall picture of this novel. It was published in 1964, and the story basically revolves around the 90-year-old Hagar Shipley, who is a cantankerous old woman. She is stubborn. She is, of course, 90-year-old, so some of her personality traits can be forgiven. She is obstinate, she is stubborn, she is cantankerous, she is an old woman, and she is living with one of her sons, Marvin, and her daughter-in-law, Doris, who are both of them in their 60s. Okay, now the action of this novel takes place on 2 levels, the past and the present. Although the present is actually takes place during the span of a few days. The narration covers a few days, not a couple of days, but maybe a week or so. But the whole past, through a series of flashbacks, is brought into the present. And therefore we get, even though she's 90 years old, Hagar, we get her whole life story through these flashes of flashbacks, through the interpolation of flashbacks. And in that way, the narration can bring into its fold 3 generations. Now, the 3 generations are Hagar's father, I think his name is Jason Curry, then herself, the second generation is Hagar herself, her husband Bram Shipley, her brothers Matt and Dan. And the third generation are her two sons, John and Marvin. So all this we come to know through a series of flashbacks. Now, Hagar's life has been shaped and has been dominated by the patriarchal values which are embodied in her father, Jason Curry. Now, her father is Scottish. He is a very proud and ambitious man. He is extremely authoritarian. He is extremely unbending, and he is proud and strong. And all these qualities Hagar inherits from her father, along with a deep-rooted sense of rebellion and a deep-rooted pride. Now, after some time, I'll explain how this pride works both in a positive way as well as in a negative way. Now, and this pride is basically her main character flaw. This is her inertia. This is what makes her strong also to a certain extent, but also is the cause of her downfall. So, this pride isolates her from the people she is very close to. For example, her father, she rebels against him. Her husband, she never actually shows her love towards the husband. Her two brothers as well as her two sons. I'll take up the details a little later. Now, because of this pride, Hagar, defies her father to marry Bram Shipley, who is socially on a slightly lower rung than herself. After that, when she marries him, she is unable to show her love to her husband also because of this prideful nature. Apart from this, she also does not allow her son John to marry the girl whom he loves, and eventually she is responsible for his death also. Now, this is what basically the story revolves against, and the present depicts Hagar's story, Hagar's present when she is 90 years old and when she is defying all the efforts of Marvin and Doris, her son and daughter-in-law, to put her into an old age home. Now, they themselves are 60 years old and their health itself is failing, and they somehow feel that they are incapable of, devoting all their time and energies to Hagar. But she is completely oblivious to their problems, and she is so obstinate, she is so stubborn and fixed in her ways that she doesn't really want to be put into an old age home, and she resists all attempts on their part to put her there. Now, this is the present, and because she is rampant with memory, so all her past events keep impinging on the present, and that is how we get to know her whole story. Okay, now before I go into the details of bondage, her flight and freedom, let me give you a brief picture of survival, which is again a sort of an entity in Canadian literature. All Canadian writers are, I would say most Canadian writers are majorly preoccupied, and they have a major obsession with survival. And today I am going to talk about some of the finer ramifications of this obsession with survival by doing an in-depth study of the stone angel. Now, when I talk of survival vis-a-vis Margaret Lawrence's fiction, I do not mean a mere physical survival, a mere physical continuity of existence. No, I also mean a spiritual survival, a emotional survival, the right to survive in a dignified manner. So there are various connotations to this term survival. And in the context of Canadian literature, survival could mean a number of things. It could be the survival of the early settlers, the colonizers who came and settled in Canada. It could be their survival against the hostile elements, against the hostile natives. It could also be a cultural survival. This whole business of the Anglophone and the Francophone literatures there, the French and the British who had gone there. Then thirdly, it could also be the survival of the nation to survive its marginalized colonial position and attain an identity of its own. And lastly, it could be the struggle of women to find their identity and survive in a male-centric society. And basically, you'll notice that in this novel, as well as her other Canadian novels, Margaret Laurence stresses on this survival of the women to attain an authentic existence for themselves, to go from a state of bondage through flight into a state of freedom. Because somewhere Margaret Laurence herself had said that her main purpose is the delineation of character, and she has done this. She has delineated the character of her protagonist by dramatizing the evolving consciousness of a series of striking individuals. She takes them through a state of, I would say, diffidence, ignorance, and denial to a positive state of confidence, knowledge, and affirmation. So this is her purpose, as she herself has stated. And therefore she is very interested in giving a voice to her women characters. But here I'd like to point out something, that the feminism of Margaret Laurence, she is known as a feminist, but it is not a very, she's not a very strong, staunch feminist. She has more of a middle of the road following. She is neither a staunch feminist nor a staunch anti-feminist. Okay, she is more of a, I would say, a humanist with an androgynous worldview, not an either or sort of a worldview, but she has an androgynous worldview. And even when she talks of this whole male versus female dichotomy in her works, this is also more of a, I would say, a metaphor rather than a literal distinction between the genders. So even though in all her novels, there is a despotic kind of a patriarchal structure which is thwarting the desires of the protagonist, this despotic patriarchal structure is not necessarily a man. It could be society, it could even be a woman, like in one of her novels, I think it's A Jest of God, and Rachel is the protagonist there. Then her mother is the patriarchal power structure whom Rachel has to resist, whom she has to rebel against and fight against. So it is this male-female dichotomy is not really a gender-specific referent. Okay, it is a symbol, it is a metaphor for all despotic, dehumanizing, patriarchal power structures. All right, so this was about survival. Now let's come to the three themes that we are going to take up of bondage, flight, and freedom. Now when the novel begins, Hagar is in a state of bondage. She is 90 years old and she is stubborn, obdurate. I've already told you her personality traits. She does not listen to her children. She has never in her life listened to her father or to her brothers. And the threads, the unraveled threads of her past are impinging very heavily on her present, and she is unable to find peace. So basically she is in a state of bondage, complete bondage, because she has lost the will to live, to have an authentic existence, and yet she cannot bring herself to sort of accept her guilt, to accept where she has gone wrong in her life. Now, there are two things that emerge as far as the theme of bondage is concerned. You can be in a state of bondage by a societal imposition. People from outside can bind you, make you live in a state of bondage. However, there are certain personality traits also within every human being which can put you in a state of bondage. Now, in the case of Hagar, her societal impositions, she suffers from both societal impositions as well as some faulty personality traits. Now, her societal impositions are her father, who is extremely strong, authoritarian, unbending, and he's inculcated all these habits in Hagar. It is also her husband, Bram Shipley, who is again a strong person in his own right, although on a social ladder he is at a lower hierarchy, and therefore she finds it more difficult to take orders from him and to kowtow to him. Okay, the third societal imposition is the break of proper appearances, which the Presbyterian society of Manavaka entails. The society was a very closed-knit kind of a society, and they always believed in appearances. What would people say? And these kind of inhibitions were put into the character of all the people living there, and it acted as a kind of a deterrent to the complete evolution of a personality. So these are the outside agencies which affected Hagar. But apart from these, the personality traits within Hagar also had a part to play, and the major personality trait of her character which influenced everything that she did was her pride, which led to her rebellion right through her life. As she also says towards the end, pride was my wilderness, and that is what leads her to her isolated state. However, I want to point out that pride is always a two-edged weapon, two-edged sword. It works in a positive way as well as in a negative way. Now, let's see how does pride become her strength. How has it helped her? Initially, because of her pride, she is able to hold her own as far as her brothers are concerned. She is always ahead of them, and even when her father beats her with a ruler, she refuses to cry, and that leads to her father even commenting that she's as sharp as a whip. At one place he says, she's as sharp as a whip, and you take after me, you've got backbone. So this is because of her pride that even her authoritarian father can sort of at one level admire her. Okay. Secondly, it also helps her to get the better of her brothers. There's an incident after which her father comments that, she's as good as a son. If only she had been a son. And he leaves the latter half of the sentence unsaid. But this is what he implies. Okay. Now, could we have the next slide, please? Now, pride also sustains her and makes her the master of her own destiny, because she marries Bram much against her father's wishes, and she goes to live with him. And it also aids her to support herself and her son John when she leaves her husband, and when she takes off and becomes the housekeeper for a man who's living on the coast. All right. So all these are the positive influences that pride helps her to gain. Fourthly, because of this pride, even at the age of 90, she is able to help herself in the hospital, and she tries to have water unaided by her daughter-in-law. So that also, it's a very admirable quality that at age 90, when you're bedridden in the hospital, actually she's in her last moments, she is able to help herself to water and does not, ask for her daughter-in-law's help. And, the novel's epigraph do not go gently into the night, rage, rage against the dying of the light, these lines by Dylan Thomas, this also express her rebellion. Her rage involves her pride. So basically it helps her, her pride helps her to hold her own, it makes her the master of her own destiny, it helps her to support herself, she becomes self-reliant, and also the rage that she has is because of her pride. So these were the positive angles. Now there are certain negative connotations also which pride has as far as Hagar's character is concerned. Now, you know, it becomes her weakness at certain points. It becomes her wilderness, as she herself says. When she is finally in the hospital bed, during her last moments, it is then that she realizes that, and she says so in so many words, that pride was my wilderness. It has warped my complete life, and this is actually Hagar's moment of truth. Okay, and because of her pride, she is put into a sort of a barbed wire fence in which she is completely isolated from all the people who love her and whom she is close to. Her father, her husband, her brothers, her sons. So these are the negative things that pride brings her to. She loses out on her husband because she never can tell him that she loves him. She loses out on her son John because she is so possessive. She has become so meanly possessive about her son that she insists that he does not marry the girl Arlene whom he loves, and eventually it leads both Arlene and John to sort of committing suicide. It's not sort of overtly mentioned in the novel, but they do get, I think, hit by a running train, and it's more or less a suicide. It's considered to be a suicide. So she interferes so much in her son's life that it leads to his eventual death. Also, she does not give way to emotions. She represses all her emotions, and in fact she becomes averse to human emotions, and this strains all the relations with the people nearest her. She does not give any comfort to her, one of her very weak brothers. You know, he is also dying because of, I think, pneumonia or something, and he asks her to drape their mother's shawl over his shoulders because she sort of resembles the mother, and in his dying moments he wants to be comforted by the memory of his mother. But Hagar is so willful, so proud, that she does not want to give in to any weakness, and she doesn't want to see her brother also in a weak state. So she doesn't do that much also for him. After that, as I've already mentioned, she represses all emotions and in fact becomes averse to all emotions. And because of this character flaw, she is in a complete state of bondage. All right. Now, from bondage, when a personality is closed, is in a state of bondage, eventually you start trying to get out of it. And that is when you take recourse to certain strategies, which are your survival strategies, basically, which are defense mechanisms. You know, they can be repression, suppression, it can be some kind of emotional insulation, whichever, as I've already mentioned, Hagar goes through all these. Okay. Now, flight is also one of the defense mechanisms that a personality takes recourse to. Now, flight can be both at the mental level as well as at a physical level. Now, as far as the mental level is concerned, I've already mentioned that Hagar goes through repression and suppression of all the painful memories. She doesn't give in to, remembering the fact that she was responsible for her son's death. She suppresses this memory. She also suppresses the fact that she is, she's never been able to show love to her husband. She suppresses the fact that she had rebelled against her father and married her husband. So, she also becomes emotionally insulated. So these are all the mental flights which she undertakes. All right. And going back into memory is also another form of flight. And at the physical level, almost all the characters of Margaret Lawrence, I must mention, not only Hagar, but all the other protagonists also, in their life run away from their home. There is a physical flight along with a mental flight. There is a physical flight in which they run away. Then they go into themselves, within themselves, they introspect, and finally they are able to attain a authentic existence, if I may put it that way. Now, even in the case of Hagar, we see that she runs off into a deserted cannery at Shadow Point. She runs away because she gets to know that Marvin and Doris, her daughter-in-law, are forcibly going to put her into an old age home. So she withdraws some money from the bank, takes a bus and runs away. And she goes down the steps into this cannery, and this is symbolic of her descent into herself. And she does a lot of introspection there because she meets a person called Murray Lees there, who has, and both of them share a drink, and in their drunken state, they confide their innermost secrets to each other. And it is then, in her drunken stupor, that Hagar is able to admit on the outside to Murray Lees, but admit on the inside to herself that she has been stubborn, that she has been over proud, that she has been responsible for her son's death, and she has made certain mistakes in her life which she had tried to suppress, and because of that suppression she is unhappy. And because she relives her past, because she goes back and down memory lane, she is able to come to terms with her past, which is another thing that all of Lawrence's characters do, which is coming to terms with their past, and because of that they sort of can go into the future. Okay. She also admits her failure as a mother to Murray Lees and to herself. So when she has gone from a state of complete bondage into flight, then she is able to come into freedom. Then she is able to emerge into a state of freedom. It leads to an expanded awareness. It leads to an inner renewal, to an evolution, inner evolution, in which she is able to subdue her pride, and this gets manifested when she is in the hospital and she is able to merge with the people there. Otherwise she's always sort of isolated herself from people. But there, there are certain instances, there are certain incidents in which we get to see that she is finally opening out and accepting people to herself. Of course, because she's 90 years old and she's lived in a certain way for all those 90 years, she's not, the transformation is not completely over, but for her, even small instances like, she forgives Murray Lees for disclosing her hiding place. Then she's able to thank the clergyman for singing to her. This was something which she would never have done before. Then she even takes off her ring and gives it to her granddaughter Tina, which is again something she had not done right through her life. And a very important thing is that she is able to admit to Marvin that he has been a better son to him than John. John has always been her favorite, even though she was meanly possessive about him, and she has always sort of disregarded Marvin's role in her life. But because of this expanded awareness that she achieves, she is able to tell Marvin that actually he has been a better son to her than John. And the last incident that she does before dying is that she even helps one of the girls in her hospital room by giving her a bedpan. So these small instances, she is able to show that she has opened out her heart. She is ready to receive people within her, even though it comes actually at her dying moment. So basically we see that the stone angel is an odyssey of the human spirit. At one level, it is the story of Hagar Shipley, but at another level, it is a metaphor, it is a symbol of the odyssey of the human spirit which goes from a state of bondage, of pride, into, and pride that isolates, mind you, into the freedom of love that binds. And Hagar Shipley's character shows us in totality how one can go from a state of bondage through a series of mental and physical flights into a state of freedom. All right. Now, this was about bondage, flight and freedom. I also mentioned that we'd be talking about the social agendas of Margaret Lawrence. You know, there are certain instances when she speaks about the natives, the native Canadian, the Native American, who are the first peoples of Canada, and how a lot of discrimination is being done against them. For example, her brothers are very fond of, going out for hunts and shoots with one of these Métis. Métis is the half-breeds between the French and the natives. And he's friends with somebody called Jules Tonry, and her father disapproves. Also, when one of the shacks catch fire, it is Hagar herself who says, good riddance to bad rubbish. So it's not as if Margaret Lawrence is condoning this kind of behavior by the colonizers. It is that she is actually exposing the discrimination that is being meted out to these natives, and in that sense she is making us as readers aware of the injustices that are being committed. All right. So she is a person, Margaret Lawrence is a writer with a social agenda. That is at one level. At the second level, she is a very staunch advocate of the rights of women. Right through, and in this novel particularly, we see that Hagar Shipley stands for every woman. She is an embodiment of all women who have to a certain extent, rebel, who have to prove to be very strong so that they can eke out a existence for themselves, an authentic existence of expanded awareness, of knowledge, of confidence and of affirmation. So through the character of Hagar Shipley, Margaret Lawrence is able to project all these angles: discrimination against women, discrimination against the natives, and all the marginalized women as well as natives. Okay, so she is basically a person with a social agenda. And here I must mention that this woman as victim paradigm was developed when she was in Africa, when she actually saw the injustices that the colonizers were meting out to the locals in Africa. That is when all her themes got crystallized, and that is when she actually decided to not live in an ivory tower, so to speak, but to take up issues related to women and to actually provide them a forum through her novels where they could be given a voice. Right? So basically, today's lecture, we have spoken about The Stone Angel, Margaret Lawrence's novel The Stone Angel, and how her protagonist Hagar Shipley goes through her bondage into flight, into a state of freedom, and how it is a metaphor for the odyssey of the human spirit. I hope you enjoyed this lecture as much as I've enjoyed giving it to you. Till then, till the next time, goodbye and good luck.